Hi guys, it's Lucy. Today I'm very excited to show you a new find, and the title is called The Japanese Garden, and the author is Sophie Walker. I found this book while I was just browsing a random store in the city, and went home, searched it up, and found a much cheaper version from chapters in ago, but I had to wait a month or two, and I received it earlier this month, and this was a really cool book. I read this cover to cover twice to get the most out of it, but I wanted to share some of the concepts and the design of your standard, there's no standard Japanese garden, but I learned a lot, and I'm not an expert by any means. I think by Bill Gates standards, I would need to read at least 6 other books on the same topic to say anything more definitively about Zen Buddhism or Japanese gardens in general. But this is just an amateur's look based on one really well done book. So it's about 300 pages, and the pages are completely matte, and so that it makes it really light instead of like the really glossy pages you usually get with art books or photography books. That's one thing that I really liked right off the bat. What drew me to this book first was the uniqueness of the design, and so when you open it, it goes like this, and the book is actually on its own, like there's a whole other cover. So I wondered about this circle. I thought it was just, out of interest or whatever, but when I read more into the pages themselves, I realized, there are screens in the gardens that look really similar to this circle, like this one as well, and they provide a fixed view into the garden themselves. But at the end of the day, the idea comes down to these 3 shapes here. So according to Zen Buddhism, everything in the universe can be reduced down to 3 shapes. So you have the not knowing square and the enlightened circle, and it's joined by a triangle in the middle, and that triangle in the sense of gardens, and you'll see this one, this is the window of confusion, or the not knowing square, and the window of enlightenment, and the triangle is actually supposed to be represented by the person who is sitting in seated meditation. So I'll try to insert a picture, but imagine a monk or like a person sitting cross-legged. That is the triangle that links the two. So the transition or the contemplation that takes place. So you would drink tea perhaps and look out the square window first, and then look at the circle next. So that's just a really cool thing that the author or the designer of the book translated into the cover. It's not just like a cool thing to make people stop and look, but at the same time, this window represents the enlightenment that we are supposed to, I guess, see or discover by going through and reading about these gardens themselves. So there are a lot of you'll see, like, I think they feature 90 gardens, and amongst like the 300 pages, I think almost every single page is either a flat out full on panel of a photograph, or half of the page is taken up. So it doesn't seem like a lot of reading, but there are 10 essays in here that are really richly composed, I would say, to give a really cool background, and they reference to the gardens themselves. That's helpful, and some of the really key concepts are repeated a little bit again in the relevant gardens in the little blurbs that come with them. So I really learned a lot, and one of the first things that I thought was cool that they mentioned was the difference between a Western garden and an Eastern garden. And this is where the view is that the Western garden, like imagine your French garden or Italian garden, the most prominent example being the gardens at Versailles. It's seeking to control nature, and the view of perfect alignment, perfect symmetry. It's just, and little things like, say, moss or weeds, anything that doesn't fit into the vision itself is eliminated vigorously. But with the Japanese garden, there's a particular sensitivity towards nature and the philosophy of accepting changes. There are a lot of moss gardens in Japan, and moss in particular is a crucial element actually over, say, plants, and they value it so much that in the winter they would cover the moss with geometrically arranged pine needles. I haven't seen this done, but I'll try to look for a photo of this. So that's a really interesting fact that I thought. But also, just going back, I'm a little bit all over the place, but going back to the circle, there was mention of the idea of a perfect circle versus a not perfect circle. So an off-centered circle still reveals confusion, similar to the square shape, whereas a perfect circle is supposed to be a symbol of actual enlightenment. And there was mention of a temple in Beijing where monks are encouraged to walk in a circle whilst contemplating life, Buddhism, whatever it is that monks are, whatever it is that you are supposed to be focusing on whilst in seated meditation. And this is a concept that I read about first in A Tale of a Time Being, and it sounded really weird when I first read it there, but that introduced me to this whole concept of seated meditation. So when it came up again in this book, I thought it was, again, serendipity that I had read that book first and then came across Japanese gardens. So I don't want to be overly religious here, but the whole idea of a circle, it really reminded me of Mecca. I've seen photos where people are walking, I think it was anti-clockwise, around that sacred symbol, and it's supposed to be representing how they are worshiping in unity in their belief of Allah. So I thought the whole idea of a circle, or practice walking in a circle, and the fact that some of these gardens have gravel that are circular, it's a very interesting thing. I always thought of architecture and gardens being very different practices and in their outcomes as well between different cultures, going from east to west to the Middle East. But this circle, this idea, is one connecting thing that I never realized until I read more about Zen Buddhism in my particular book here. So moving on to type of gardens, the first type that I came across, and there's a huge essay on this, but I still don't really quite understand because it didn't mention any point of origin. So I'm referring to dry gardens, and dry gardens are type of gardens like these where you've got elements of rock and gravel, not a lot of greenery, to be honest. This one is probably the greenest one. These gardens, some of them are entirely gravel with raked patterns, so either raked in a circle or raked like waves. It's a really strong statement when there is a pile of gravel in a garden. It is quite artificial versus what I was saying before about Japanese gardens being borrowing from nature or try to emulate nature in a miniature controlled way. But a rock garden or a dry garden is entirely artificial. But sometimes I think when they do have elements like these rocks are actually selected very specifically, and they're usually volcanic rocks. So this has to do with fractals, and again, another essay, but fractals in nature being when you zoom in on something, it is a microcosm of the bigger thing itself, kind of like a broccoli. Like if you look at one stem of one little floret, and then of the entire, and then zooming out to look at the entire broccoli crown, it would be a little tiny version of the crown itself. It's supposed to look like landscape, like even when you zoom in on the surface of the rock itself, like it won't be like a little just smooth all over, but it'll look rigid and you can't really tell the scale. So there's something to do with scale related to the rocks and the way they're placed, and more symbolism. There's just symbolism all over the place. I think there are probably a lot of experts, and if this is something you're interested in, dry gardens is a very big thing in Japan. Another type of garden that was categorized as broadly being courtyard gardens. So these are intimate spaces. They're designed to be viewed from the inside, and some of them are really, really, really small, and some of them are I suppose larger. Like if you go to the Imperial Palace, of course, the courtyards are going to be larger than a tiny little temple or even an inn. So the traditional inns in Kyoto, some of them have very small gardens viewable just from inside your own room and just that room itself. So like examples being kind of like this one or on the next page here. These are hugely intimate places, and they're supposed to bring about a sense of calm and, again, contemplation. Some of these are, like, if you look at this garden here, it looks quite overgrown, wild-ish, but an interesting thing is that the blinds are drawn specifically up until this point, and it's blocking the actual commercial building that looks like a skyscraper or like some sort of a tower that would remind you of 21st century Tokyo, and it's specifically drawn to block that view from your mind completely when you are sitting there viewing the garden. But I think that's a really cool, a lot of these are very small details that are considered to the extent where I just don't know what this is. Probably somebody's full-time study. Like, I wouldn't even call this a job. So just a small example, I was reading about pine trees and how they manage. So every year these pines, when we go to visit, we see a headline, oh, this pine tree is 700 years old or 500 years old, and there are those actually, and we think, wow, this tree is really strong, or it's so suited for the weather. But in reality, each tree is especially the pines, they are trimmed twice a year, and when they are undergoing this process, each needle is considered, so 2/3 of the new growth for each ear is trimmed off in a way that is supposed to represent the ideal image of the tree. So think, symmetry and just positioning. So each needle is considered, is this part of, the trimmed version? Is this the idealized image of the tree? And then they go about and execute. That's just an enormous amount of thought and effort, and it's supposed to be a continuous process. That's what's really important. The work is never really done. You can rake all the leaves, but the image of the perfect garden is one not where it's entirely, the floor is swept, because that is an end state and there shouldn't be an end state. So of course not all the gardens are going to be miniatures in scale. There are a lot of these stroll gardens that I came across. Example, this is a Chestnut Grove garden. It's not one of the great 3 gardens of Kyoto, but or this one. This is supposed to be a public garden, which is rare because most of these were originally designed for residences or the imperial family, etc. This one is a public one to be enjoyed together, and it's supposed to bloom very early in spring or late winter, so end of February. And there are supposedly 3,000 plum trees. So it's the plum blossoms that people will be watching before the cherry blossoms come on in April. The essays also mention tea gardens. That is there is a whole essay on tea ceremony and symbolic relationships in Zen Buddhism. There are also lotus ponds and discussions about bridges. So all of those key elements and even key plants are discussed. So that's why I really appreciated this book, for the amount of just historical, or not historical, it is historical, but it's more of cultural context that I think a lot of us, or at least I, missed when I visited Kyoto for the first time. This is just, I think, a must-read. If you're going to visit any garden in Kyoto, you will appreciate them so much more, and also you'll have a lot more to add on your to-visit list. I know I have marked, when I went about reading this book, I first took stickies and tried to mark down all the ones that I wanted to visit, and I ended up with like a really messy, just almost every other page type of situation that I need to sort out a bit more. So I'll end with two contrasting types of Japanese gardens. One is the view where gardens are transitional places where you would enter them and see the layered perspectives from the stroll, or from different viewpoints that are specifically designed. And some of these are even really, say, long passageways, like this one that we all know from Memoirs of a Geisha. This is Fushimi Nari, and the torii gates are one after another, and it forms a tunnel, like an extended transition or extended bridge. So bridging, as all gardens are supposed to be, the intermediary between the earthly and the heavenly, the profane and the sacred. So this idea versus another type of garden, that being the uninterable garden, which is another essay, very short essays in this book. The uninterable garden is one, like the name suggests, cannot be entered. And this type of garden requires an even further level of mind games, I would say. I'll read the quote here. It challenges us to see with our eyes and process with our minds in order to know in our hearts. And this type of garden demands a willingness to venture beyond knowledge and instinct, and forcing us to change our understanding of what we think we know. So if that is not mind games, then what is? I'll show you a version of one of these uninterable gardens. So this is what the front of the garden looks like, and this is the place where the visitor would sit and stare out at this garden without being able to walk in or walk around to actually view the plants or the scenery in great detail. So this is a view of inside the pavilion, or what do they call it, like a space for viewing. And I wanted to leave with a poem that I found within this book itself. And I think, imagine yourself sitting here in this garden and think about this poem. It's written by a garden maker and monk named Muso Soseki. I'm sure I'm not saying that right, but for our purposes, he writes, "A pine tree with long needles has grown behind it. On top of the tower, there is a Buddha image of eternal happiness. Now the doors and windows are all open, and nothing inside is hidden. Dharma worlds beyond number are there for you to see." I think that is very encouraging of all of us, intentionally seeking enlightenment, or those of us living our everyday lives, perhaps not trying intentionally to seek enlightenment, but seek some sort of contentment on the way in all of our journeys. Thanks for listening to me gush about Japanese gardens. This was fun. Leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts. I would love to hear from you. Bye.